The Conservatives have announced their first election pledges. And if you're a young person, you've had a bit of a stinker.
Oh, here we go again.
Pensioners are due to pay zero tax on their pensions under a quadruple lock regime. Young people under the age of 30 are due to have mandatory blood donations so that over 65s can have their lifetimes extended, and 18-year-olds are due to have mandatory conscription into either the army or a volunteer force that will deliver prescription medicines and food to older folk.
That is why we will introduce a bold new model of national service for 18-year-olds, with 1 weekend per month volunteering in roles within the community, like delivering prescriptions and food to infirm people.
Only 2 of these are actually true, but they do seem almost a parody of themselves, and in my opinion, they represent the beginning of intergenerational warfare. As British and European society ages, policies like these will only become more and more common as politicians seek to win the great vote. I've seen a lot of articles written in support of these policies over the last week, and I want to take the time to debunk them thoroughly and explain why they're absolute nonsense and why this is incredibly unfair for young people. Let's start off with national service. Rishi Sunak has announced that under a new Tory government, 18-year-olds would be forced to do a year of military training with the army or choose to volunteer in community service for 2 days a month. Now, community service is traditionally reserved for those who've committed crimes, but for the crime of being young,
Get off my lawn.
And by being able to solve 2 birds with 1 stone, this is the idea that they've proposed. The 2 birds being, this is a huge vote winner with the over 65s, and the second being that public services may be able to be improved without having to spend very much money on it. After all, they're volunteers. It's hard to call it volunteering though when the only alternative is to serve in the army. It seems more like being forced than volunteering in my opinion, by definition. I want to address this article in the Daily Telegraph by Hamish de Breton Gordon. It's actually absurd. He argues that all young people should be forced to do national service, not just 18-year-olds. And listen to his arguments. Hamish argues that young people who benefited so much from COVID lockdowns and furlough should have to repay their country by doing this national service. But he does let the mask slip a little bit when he says that young people probably need some exercise because they spend all their time glued to their phones. I think that is pretty telling as to the utter contempt he feels for young people. But let's address the elephant in the room here. Did young people actually benefit from lockdowns and furlough? First of all, there's a huge amount of historical revisionism when it comes to COVID in Hamish's statement here. As we all know, COVID was primarily fatal to people in the older generation. In fact, over 90% of COVID deaths in the UK over the last few years has been in the over 60 category. And young people gave up their lives, education, and ordinary daily routines in order to save older people without many grumbles, in all honesty.
But what about the nation's service to our 18-year-olds? What about our sense of duty to them and what they've been through? And I'm picking up on what Wes said. This is a generation who lost years, the best years of their life. They were banned from going to parties by people who then had a series of illicit parties themselves. Absolutely. In the heart of government.
And yet now the argument's been turned on its head, saying that lockdowns were primarily there to benefit the young people. In fact, under the Conservative policy, many of the 18-year-olds who will have to undergo national service are the children who faced massive disruption to their educations due to the lockdowns and not being able to have lessons in person. In fact, many experts have estimated that educational gaps like illiteracy amongst disadvantaged students may take over 10 years to return to their pre-COVID levels. That's pretty insane of a sacrifice to ask of them after they've already had to sacrifice their educations. Perhaps the over 65s should consider doing national service as well to make up for the debt that they owe to the nation when it comes to lockdowns. If that conjures Dad's Army vibes for you, then listen to what Hamish has to say next. He argues that Britain has 100,000 old age veterans who would be willing to whip these youngsters up into shape, get them ready to fight Russia. Well, I'm sure that Putin is trembling in his boots at the sight of a trained army full of old age veterans and 18-year-olds. I would say though that he does have a point when it comes to furlough. I do wonder why this kind of national service, where young people would be delivering medicine and food to older people, wasn't implemented during the pandemic. Surely that would have been the ideal time to do it. Rather than pay people to do nothing, pay them to do that instead. It's interesting to look at the support for this policy by age group. As you get older, there's more and more support for national service for 18-year-olds. From 65% of 18 to 24-year-olds being opposed to this policy, whereas 63% of over 65s are in support of it. It's very easy to support a policy that you've never had to do yourself. And yes, over 65s are likely not to have done national service themselves, as it was abolished in 1960, which means that the youngest people to have done national service are currently 82, or 18 in 1960, or born in 1942. So the majority of over 65s have not done this themselves. Now let's talk about the other controversial conservative policy, the triple lock plus, or the quadruple lock on pensions. Currently, we have a system called the triple lock where pensions must rise by the minimum of either 2.5%, the average of inflation, or the average earnings by people of working age every single year. That means that spending on pensions increases as a percentage of public net spend every year as well, and is very controversial because it means that pensioners are guaranteed a pay rise every year when people like nurses, doctors, and other people who work in the public sector do not have that guarantee. The new guarantee proposed by the government would be that pensioners would never have to pay any income tax on their pensions. The reason why this has been a concern by pensioners recently is that tax bands have been frozen over the last few years and will be frozen going forwards so that the government can pay off its debts and get more money in income tax via fiscal drift. But that also means that because pensions have been increasing guaranteed every year, the amount of pension paid to pensioners is about to approach the tax-free limit by which pensioners would have to pay tax were it to go over that limit. So effectively, the government is proposing that pensioners should pay a different tax rate to ordinary working people. We're all in this together unless we want to buy your vote effectively. Pensioners already pay a lower rate of tax than working age people if they continue to work. That's because they're exempt from national insurance. And don't get it wrong, national insurance is a form of tax. If it wasn't, you'd be able to opt out of it and opt out of the public pension too, but you can't, so it is effectively a tax. The fact that pensioners don't have to pay that if they continue to work is already insanely generous. Giving them the opportunity to not have to pay income tax on their pensions too would be a step too far in my opinion. Now, supporters of the quadruple lock on pensions would probably point out that Britain's public pensions are some of the worst in Europe. And they wouldn't be wrong, at least when you look at it in absolute terms. But that does not tell the full story. Britain has always had an expectation that individuals will supplement their public pension incomes with their own private pensions when it comes to retirement. And that's been the norm for decades now. That's why Britain has been able to have a lower tax rate than much of Europe over the last few decades because it wasn't paying out as much in pensions. And older people have benefited from those lower rates of tax during their entire lifetimes. Why should tax rates be raised so much now that they're going to retire so that younger people can pay for them to have more in public pensions? That's not even to mention the scandal of the fact that older people are much more likely to have gold-plated defined benefit pensions. That's a pension which effectively offers you a percentage of your final salary upon retirement, and a type of pension that is no longer available for young people. Young people now have to effectively set aside a percentage of their incomes, put them into their own private pension, and hope the stock market goes up. That kind of luxury that older people had is not available to younger people. That's not even to mention the fact that the UK has a number of generous tax benefits when it comes to putting money into your own private pensions. Most European countries do not have that level of benefit. And it shows that individuals are expected to use private pensions. So the public pension should not be as high as European countries by definition, pretty much. In addition to that, European countries often change the amount of pension that you are eligible for depending on the amount that you have contributed to the system during your working age lifetime, such as Spain, for example. That is not the case in the UK. It doesn't matter how much you put into the system, you will receive the same amount out of the system, as long as you've contributed even £1 to national insurance per year during your lifetime. That is a far more generous system, in my opinion. The next thing that the baby boomer generation and above will say with regards to pensions and why they deserve a quadruple lock is, well, we paid into the system during our lifetimes, so we deserve to be paid back now. Well, sure, that may be true, but when you actually examine the claim in detail, the baby boomer generation is set to receive far more from the state during the course of their lifetimes in total than they paid in, whereas younger generations are set to pay in far more than they receive back, which does not seem fair at all. Younger people are effectively paying older people to get more than they will receive in their own lifetimes. That breaks the social contract, the expectation that as you get older, you will receive the rewards for what you've sacrificed during your youth. But I don't see any sign of this intergenerational unfairness going away anytime soon when it comes to pensions. When you look at a YouGov poll of the support for the Conservatives' plan for a quadruple lock, you can see that most pensioners are not satisfied with the pledges that they've given. They want more. 54% of pensions do not think that the Conservatives' plans on pensions goes far enough. But it gets even worse. When you look at people who are under the age of 49, you can see that most people have no idea about the plans or whether they're beneficial to them or not. So it's unlikely that anything will change. As the proportion of older people as a percentage of the general population continues to increase over the coming decades, I predict that this problem will get even worse, with politicians offering more cynical ploys to win the grey vote every single year and making a mockery of the democratic system. So I don't see it getting better anytime soon. We can just pray that they offer less youth-bashing policies, like the fact that 18-year-olds would have to do national service, in addition to the ones where they're trying to bribe older people. Britain is not the only country facing issues resulting from its aging population and lackluster economic growth. I've spoken at length about how many other European countries are also facing the exact same problems and what young people can do about the issues resulting from it. In this video here, please click on it if you would like to see more about that. If not, please like the video and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.